Hello and welcome to the video. In this video I'd like to take a quick look at this model here. This is the DYS Elf. Now it looks like it's about the same size as the kind of tiny Whoop, but it's a little bit bigger. It's about 110mm side to side. Wheelbase I think it's about 83mm, but it is a tiny Whoop on steroids, and actually this has very quickly become my favourite little FPV ship. Unfortunately this used to be my favourite and I have loved it. It has been used and abused. You can tell by all of the snapped prop guards that I've had. I've had quite a few of these kind of tiny Whoop style indoor guys and they are fine, but they're brushed. They're good fun, but I've always wanted the extra power of a brushless system, and that's exactly what we're looking at here. We have little brushless motors, little 5-bladed props, an FPV setup inside here, and a little 2S battery as well. And this is fantastic fun to fly. So I've kind of let the cat out of the bag in terms of the summary, but this is definitely something that you're interested in, maybe getting hold of a small model to play with indoors in bad weather, or you're looking to learn and play with FPV and you want something that's pretty robust, or you just want something that's easy to slip into your bag to take to the field to goof around with FPV. This is definitely worth having a look at. So before we go any further, let me very quickly give you the rest of the specs. So this is about an 88 gram weight. It's actually a carbon fibre underneath with all the spars, which is one of the reasons it's so nice. We have LEDs for orientation in each of the corners. It is an 83mm wheelbase, so again it's a little bit bigger than your standard tiny Whoops, but that's a good reason for that. It has BE1102 10,000 kV brushless motors. Inside it's an F3 base flight controller running Betaflight. We'll connect it to the computer. I'll show you the standard defaults in a second. The standard defaults are pretty good actually, and we'll see when we fly around. The default tune isn't bad either. It has BL Heli S 10 amp ESCs with D-Shot support. So we're starting to already, halfway down this list, you're starting to see why I like it so much. There's a lot of the latest and greatest technology in this. So although it's a small little model, it hasn't been sacrificed in terms of spec. 800 TVL line camera. Again, it's one of those little cameras with a little lens. It does a very good job for the size of camera that it is, but we'll look at that in a second. In fact, if you take the top off, the way you do that is you have to undo, there's kind of 5 screws here in the bottom. If you pop the top off, then we've got kind of a standalone FPV setup, and you've also got the receiver in there as well. The receiver in this is an FrSky compatible, running over S-Bus. You need a D8 protocol to buy into this. I'll look at the 2 different versions that this comes in a second. There's the one where you just get the model, the battery and the charger with a couple of spare props, and there's a much bigger version where you actually get all of that, but you also get the radio as well, and I'll show you what that one looks like. Even has an on-screen display. Yeah, believe it or not, has an on-screen display in here as well. 600 mAh battery pack, about 5 or 6 minutes depending on how you're flying, but on that on-screen display you have that artificial horizon if you wanted it, but you also have things like the voltage of your pack as well. And those little 5-bladed 1735 props are running inside guards, and the guards are pretty solid. So I've bounced off all kinds of things, and in fact you can probably see little bits of grass stuck in the props in this. I've flown it indoors, I've flown it outdoors, and pretty much every time you crash you just pick it up, put it right way around, and you're good to go. In fact, most of the time you crash outdoors, because of the weight of the battery, it tends to end up the right way around and you're off and flying again. So let me very quickly show you how it comes in the box and show you the 2 different versions that are available depending on whether or not you've already got an FrSky or compatible transmitter to talk to the onboard receiver, or you haven't and you want to get the one with the radio. The smaller box looks like this, so it talks about the specs, has the things on the side. I'll talk about the fact, because on here it talks about it being 25 and 200 milliwatt FPV system. It is, but we'll talk about that in a second. That's one thing we just have to be careful with. The way it comes then is you just pull it out of the packet. You have a manual, which is actually pretty good. The back half is in a language I can't read. The front half gives you kind of the standard specs and how you set everything up. It's nice and easy to set all of the bands and frequencies. There's a little button underneath and you press and hold it for 3 seconds to change the modes between the channel and the band that you're playing with, and it has little flashing LEDs. The number of flashes indicate which band you're in and which channel in that band too. But then the model itself looks like this. There's the guy that we've just been looking at. Popped him back here so you can see how it comes. We have a mains adapter, battery charger. The mains adapter isn't fantastic. It'll take about an hour to charge the battery, so with 5 or 6 minutes flight time you're going to spend a lot of time waiting for this to finish. So my tip would be, if you're going to get one of these, get at least one more of these little batteries. And the only other thing in the pack then is some spare props, which is a lovely touch. I've not managed to break one yet, touch wood, and that's with some slightly wacky flying. So that's the smaller version. Let me get the bigger version and I'll show you how that's different. So this is the version that comes not only with the ELF but with a compatible radio too. And the way this comes, very similar. It's a much bigger box, obviously. You kind of pull it out of the package. Slightly different manual, because now it's got all the information in here about how you set up and manage the radio. Open it up, we have the same kind of stuff. We have the model itself. We also have the charger and the adapter. There's our little battery, the 600 milliamp hour. We have the spare props, and we also get this little guy, which is a little radio. Mode 2, so throttle's on the left hand side. Takes AA batteries. You need 4 of those in the back, and away you go. And then the switches on the top here, and the switches will give you the flight modes. It'll go ARM. It'll also give you the OSD things, because you can actually change the OSD settings with the switch, and also give you the beeper mode too. So if you lose it in long grass, it will make a nice noise, and that's a very handy feature. These things come in lots of different colours. I ended up with 2 blue ones, but when you lose this in long grass it disappears, so the fact you've got a buzzer feature is great. Now this is quite a basic radio. It's talking the FrSky D8 protocol, but if you haven't got a radio, or you want to get something that you get everything inside the box to go and play with, then this is a great way to start off. So let's connect this little guy up to Betaflight. I've never connected this one up to the computer. Let me show you the default settings in here. We have the USB connector at the back, and then underneath we have the buttons for bind, and we also have the button for the FPV settings, and that's the little light by the side of it, and then that there is to access and change anything on the OSD that you'd want to. So let's plug this in and I'll show you what this thing looks like in Betaflight. So here we are on the computer. We'll plug this little guy in for the first time. Again, we're just going to pop the USB cable up its rear end, and then there we go. You hear the little beeper that's on the little guy. If we connect on the computer, as I move the model, there it is all moving on the screen, and also hopefully you can see there that we have those LEDs for orientation as well. Now it won't power the FPV equipment and all that stuff, you need the battery plugged in for that, but this is easily enough for us to just do a quick run through and show you how this guy's configured. In terms of the accelerometer calibration, it all looks pretty good. Let's just enable expert mode so we can see what we're doing. We don't have a battery plugged in, so we haven't got any of that gubbins. Ports, UART1 is set for multi-we serial protocol, and UART3 is set for a serial receiver, so we are using S-Bus. Configuration is set to Quad X, as you'd expect. Amazingly, this is what made me laugh when I first started looking at these things. D-Shot 600 is the ESC protocol. Motor stop is turned on. I quite like that for these little quads, particularly when they're going down into long grass. It means that they're not then basically trying to pretend that they are lawn mowers, so you can turn that on and off. Then we've got serial based receiver for S-Bus, so if you really wanted to, you could probably get one of these and put your own S-based receiver in it as well. We have VBAT turned on, we have current meter turned on, the accelerometer is obviously enabled. Finish up in failsafe. Transponders turned on, no idea why that is, and on-screen display is turned on as well. Failsafe is set like that. PID tuning is pretty default stuff, but works really nicely on this little guy. The receiver is set for the radio that comes with it, although of course you're probably going to want to set it up with your own radio if you want to. You are going to need the standard throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder, and 4 auxiliary channels set up, which the radio that comes with it has. That's because in modes, this is how it's set up by default. So auxiliary 1 is your arming switch, low is not armed, high is armed. Air mode is set with auxiliary 2, which also does your main flight modes. So in the low position, the switch is angle, middle position is horizon, the top is rate mode, and you only get air mode turning on in rate mode, which is fine. I normally have air mode actually on in horizon as well in case. Beeper is auxiliary 4, so flicking that last switch will make it sound, and auxiliary 3 actually has the low and high positions to change how the OSD actually looks. Now I actually tweaked mine around when I did mine with my FR Sky Taranis radio, but this is how it's there by default, and this is how the radio that comes with it is already configured. So auxiliary 1 is arming, auxiliary 2 is flight modes, auxiliary 3 is your on-screen display, and auxiliary 4 is the beeper. This was the only thing that I was a little bit sad about. It isn't a Betaflight on-screen display, so you can't configure it through here. It's like having a little minim OSD by the side of your flight controller, and it behaves in exactly the same way. Last thing I'll do then, let's go in here and just type in version, see what we have ended up with. So this is an SP Racing F3 3.1.5. Actually, so it's pretty current, actually, only a couple of versions down as I'm recording the video. So we're reasonably up to date. Let's come back out of that. So now we've done that, we've had a look at it, let's actually take this little guy out to the field and I'll show you some FPV footage to show you what the camera's like and talk a little bit about what this guy is like to fly. Flying this thing can be summed up in 2 words: great fun. The thrust is about twice the weight, so it hovers around 50% throttle, so it hasn't got ridiculous amounts of power like some of the 250 racer class. To me it feels like some of the older models we built 18 months, 2 years ago, where it was running on 3S and you had a 2205 motor. So this feels very familiar to me. The way it's tuned and the way it performs is really nice, and the camera's not doing a bad job. Again, we're flying in one of those overcast days where the sky is very bright and the ground isn't, so occasionally when I'm not banked over enough we are getting a slightly underexposed ground. But I'm easily getting 150 meters away from myself here and managing with the FPV signal. I'm popping into horizon and rate mode, doing flips and rolls. As long as you've got a little bit of altitude and you're blipping the throttle before you try that kind of maneuver, it's handling with ease. Again, had a couple of little accidents with this thing where I bounced off or misread a turn and ended up tumbling on the ground. And for those situations where you land upright, because the battery and the props are held up a little bit, if the grass isn't too long, then you can blip the throttle and you're up in the air again. In the bottom left hand corner, keep an eye on that battery voltage. As soon as it gets around the 6.8, 6.7, then you need to bring it in and land it, because that's pretty much all you're going to get. Flight times is around 5.5 minutes. That's what I've set my timer to on the radio. If you're flying full out all the time, you might get a little bit less, but if you're being careful with your throttle, you might get a little bit more and maybe get up towards the just over the 6 minute mark. So now we've seen some FPV footage, you've seen this little guy in action, let me give you my final thoughts. At the start of the video, I kind of let the cat out of the bag by saying how much I like this thing, and it does remind me of a small dog that I had when I was a kid, that little dog would take on the biggest and baddest dogs in the street and not bat an eyelid, and this little DYS elf kind of reminds me of that little dog, because the component specifications and the way it flies are very reminiscent of a much larger model. So let me cover the things that I'm really impressed with this. I like the fact that it is an FR Sky bind and fly for those of us that have the OpenTX radios. If you can get the D8 protocol on those radio, then you can bind to this little guy and you can fly. Or if you haven't got one of those, or you want to get one of these for somebody that hasn't got a radio at all to learn to fly, and then potentially transfer onto FPV, then it's also available as well. Interestingly, the price that I've seen online for the one with the radio versus the one without, there isn't that much difference, so the radio seems to be quite a deal at the moment. They are very tough and huge fun to fly. The basic tune isn't bad, and the way it performs is very forgiving. There's a nice amount of power for acro flying, and it will cope with flying in light winds. It'll actually cope with flying in quite big winds actually, but it does mean that you have to be quite cranked over, and a gust will eventually push it down the field. Camera is not bad. It's one of the best cameras that I've used with these kind of mini lenses. You always sacrifice image quality, and if you're not using something with a wide dynamic range, then you're going to have the kind of effect that we occasionally saw on the FPV footage. But this one is a nice camera, and it's probably the best one that we've tried. Works brilliantly indoors, and even in those challenging conditions, it works okay outside too. Now on the package, it talks about the fact that it's a 300-meter range. I would say that 300 meters is a little bit enthusiastic. We'll talk about the FPV power in a second, but this has a stubby little aerial for FPV underneath. You might actually get slightly better reception on your FPV goggles using a dipole whip aerial than something like a circular polarized. I do like the fact it's got the integrated buzzer and the OSD as well. These are all little things that when you're building your own quads, you add in later on as upgrades once you've got the basic quad flying. I love the fact that it's all in there, ready to rock and roll, set up, and it just works. Things to be aware of course, is the fact that we are talking about using the D8 protocol, which some FrSky radios will not have on there. So again, if you don't have that D8 protocol enabled, whether that's because you're in the EU and you're using EU firmware or whatever that is, then it might be better getting the one that comes with the radio as well. I liked a little bit more power because it is so fun to fly and I'm flying it so regularly. I do find that it's the one that I'm kind of throwing in the backpack with bigger quads when I'm going out and about, because I'll attempt daft things in this little guy that I won't in the bigger quads. Flying through dense wooded areas or through goalposts, those kind of things, I don't mind doing it with this one because it's quite small, it'll get through the gaps, and secondly, because of those prop protectors, if I do mess it up, then it isn't going to get broken. Get yourself another battery because it does take a long time to charge. It takes about an hour and you only get 5 minutes flight time. So if you're going to order one of these, get yourself another battery. Having it supplied with 2 batteries in the pack would have been lovely. Then you can be charging one as you're flying the other. It is a non-standard connector for the battery. They haven't gone with a JST or something like an XT30 connector. It's not a big problem, but it does mean that you're going to have to make an adapter if you want to use another LiPo charger to cut down on that charging time. And last thing to talk about is be careful. This little guy defaults to 200 milliwatts FPV power. Now on the side of the box it talks about the fact it's either 25 or 200 milliwatts, and originally I think the intention from DYS that was going to be selectable using a switch. Now due to space considerations they've got rid of that, so there's actually a little soldered blob here, and you can see it on the left hand side. So the way it comes applied is those little 2 contacts are soldered together. That then puts the FPV transmitter into 200 milliwatt mode. If you want to remain legal and fly in the 25 milliwatt mode, then you're going to have to get the tip of a little craft knife and just cut through that solder and separate those 2 contacts, and it will go back to being a 25 milliwatt transmitter. So hopefully that's been useful for those of you that have been looking at this. Personally, this is the model that I'm going to recommend for those who are looking to learn to fly and then also maybe move into FPV, because this one little guy will let you do both of those things. The radio is not a bad quality at all, and for those pilots that don't have a radio and are looking to just start out, this is a really nice way to get into the hobby and get some of the benefits of the latest and greatest technology without paying ridiculous amounts of money. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. We try and release at least 2 videos a week, usually a quick tip on a Tuesday and a more in-depth video on a Friday, and sometimes we manage to get a few more out as well. If you're interested in radio control, then the playlists are useful to have a look at. Anything that's called Introduction To is an organised set of videos that teach you from first principles about the subject that you're interested in. But we also have information about the majority of popular open source flight controllers, how to build quadcopters, fixed wing models, reviews, setups, unboxing, all kinds of things in here as well. So if you haven't already had a look at the playlist, then I'd recommend going and have a look through here to see if there's anything that takes your fancy. Finally, we do also provide updates through things like Twitter, Instagram, and also post all of our 3D designs on Thingiverse as well. So if you like what we're doing here on YouTube, have a look at those things and subscribe to us there, and you'll find out what we're up to in advance of the videos coming out here on the channel.